picture this, right? A land abundant, brimming with resources, but instead of prosperity, a horrific famine, it's Bengal, 1943. A story of the British Empire.
Really controversial chapter.
Yeah, deeply controversial.
Okay.
And, it raises questions about power, responsibility, things we're still grappling with.
Yeah, it's still relevant today.
Big time. And that's what we're diving into today, the Bengal Famine of 43. Trying to unravel the facts.
The myths, the debates.
Exactly. And, using historical accounts, analyses.
Yeah, a lot of sources to dig into.
So we can really understand.
The impact, the causes.
Yeah, the long-term consequences. This is a big one.
Yeah.
So Bengal, right? Often called the jewel of British India.
Yeah, rich in culture, resources.
Right. Prosperity. You'd think so, right? But to get how this famine happened, we need to look at, the colonial economic policies.
The long-term impact.
Exactly, because the British, they were all about their own gain.
Right, above local welfare.
Yeah, the system was kind of designed that way.
Absolutely.
Like the permanent settlement.
Yeah, with land revenue.
Fixed taxes, high rates.
Didn't matter how the harvests were.
Yeah, farmers were squeezed.
Constant pressure.
Huge pressure, so basically.
These policies reshaped Bengal's economy.
Yeah.
And made it super vulnerable.
They had to rely on food imports.
Especially rice from Burma.
Burma, yeah, and that becomes really important later on.
Huge.
So setting the stage right, in 1942, a bad rice harvest in Bengal.
Not a good start.
Not good at all. And then, bam, Japan occupies Burma.
Cutting off that rice supply.
Exactly. And on top of all that, wartime inflation.
Prices just skyrocketed.
So even if there was food,
people couldn't afford it.
Right. And it's World War II, huge demands on resources.
Absolutely.
But the sources point to something really controversial.
British policies during the famine.
Yeah, what did they do?
Right. Like, there's evidence that grain was being diverted.
For the war effort.
Yeah, and this is disturbing. They allowed speculation in food markets.
So prices went up even more.
Lining pockets while people starved.
That's awful. And I think what's really hard to swallow is there were warnings about food shortages.
Right, from the war's impact.
But the British officials, they just dismissed them.
They didn't take it seriously.
A huge misjudgment. And then you read the survivor accounts, it's heartbreaking.
It really is.
Empty villages.
Corpses on the roadside.
The people selling everything they had just for some rice.
Desperate.
Just to survive another day.
Absolutely. And it wasn't just starvation.
Right. There were other effects.
Disease ran rampant. Cholera, dysentery.
Oh, terrible.
Yeah, made worse by malnutrition.
So many deaths. And it's like the social fabric broke down.
Absolutely. Communities struggling.
No one could help each other.
They were barely surviving themselves.
Right. And it's so important to remember this didn't hit everyone equally.
Sadly not.
The rural workers, the sharecroppers.
They were hit the hardest.
They had nothing to fall back on.
No land, no savings.
And while they were starving,
the urban elites, the British officials,
they were largely fine.
They could afford the high prices.
It's just such a stark difference.
Yeah.
It shows the inequality.
Deep-seated in the colonial system.
And, to make things even worse, there was hoarding, people taking advantage of the scarcity.
Making money off of suffering.
So this is the big question for you listening. Did the British actually prioritize their war effort?
Over the lives of millions.
That's what it looks like.
The evidence is compelling.
Yeah, when you consider everything, the consequences.
This brings us to Churchill.
Oh, a controversial figure.
Absolutely.
And his role in all this.
The accusations against his government
are serious.
Extremely.
They refused to release food stocks.
Yeah, to prioritize famine relief.
Even though officials in India were begging for help.
Begging, pleading for assistance.
And then there's that quote.
You know the one?
Why hasn't Gandhi died yet?
Chilling.
It seems like he didn't care.
Indifference to Indian suffering.
And some historians say he was just focused on the war.
World War II was consuming everything.
Right. But our sources, they also point to
another narrative.
His biases, his government's economic ideology.
And how they influenced decisions.
Or lack of decision.
Yeah, the inaction.
And the documents, the British government documents.
They paint a damning picture.
Indian officials sending urgent requests.
We need food aid.
But London kept rejecting them.
Logistical difficulties, they said.
Excuses.
It's hard to believe.
Yeah, and here's the kicker.
Yeah.
There was grain available.
In Australia, other British territories.
But they didn't send it to Bengal.
Why not?
They were stockpiling it for Europe.
It seems their priority was clear.
And the response in Bengal itself, It was, well,
It was slow.
slow, inadequate.
Yeah, despite the clear evidence of starvation.
Like, they didn't grasp the urgency.
Or they chose to ignore it.
And get this, India was exporting grain
To Britain and its allies.
at the same time as the famine.
It's just mind-boggling.
And the viceroy, Lord Linlithgow,
He tried,
he tried to get London to understand.
but it didn't seem to work.
He just couldn't get through to them.
About the scale of the disaster.
So it wasn't all bad. There were local efforts.
Yeah, Indian charities, nationalists, regular people.
They stepped up with whatever they had.
They showed incredible compassion.
Yeah, trying to help each other.
And it highlights how insufficient the official response was.
It was too little, too late.
For millions, it was too late.
Yeah, and this was a different time, right, with media.
Yeah, the world was more connected,
So you'd think news would travel fast.
but there was censorship.
The British, they restricted reporting,
They wanted to control the narrative.
keep it quiet, but they couldn't hide it forever.
Thankfully not.
There were journalists like Ian Stevens.
The statesman,
His reporting, his photos, they exposed the truth.
graphic, powerful images,
In late 1943, it finally broke through
and that led to international pressure.
on the British to do something.
But tragically, for men,
It was already too late.
far too late.
And even then, the British used propaganda.
To downplay the crisis.
It's not that bad, they said.
To maintain morale.
So you had these two narratives.
Yeah, colonial newspapers blaming overpopulation.
Local mismanagement, they said.
But Indian nationalists, international journalists,
They were telling the real story.
systemic failure, neglect, exploitation.
And the political fallout, huge.
Enormous.
The famine, it fueled anti-British sentiment.
It added fuel to the fire.
The Quit India movement from 42.
Yeah, gained momentum.
People were demanding independence.
They'd had enough.
Leaders like Bose, Gandhi, Nehru.
They all condemned British rule.
The famine was proof, they said.
We need self-rule, they argued.
The British had lost their trust.
They'd shown their true colors.
And in 1947,
Yeah,
India gained independence.
a direct result, in part, of the famine.
It showed that Indian lives.
Didn't matter to the empire.
And this wasn't the only famine, right? Under British rule.
Sadly enough.
The Great Famine of 1876-78.
Millions dead.
The Irish Famine.
A recurring pattern.
So, were these just economic bad luck?
Yeah.
Or was it something more?
A systemic failure of colonial governance.
That's the question. Was famine
Baked into the system.
built into empire? And one thing that's consistent
Yeah.
is this laissez-faire economics.
Hands off, they said.
The market will sort it out.
But people were starving.
And they wouldn't regulate food prices.
Or distribute aid effectively.
Because of ideology.
It cost lives.
You combine that with, the racial hierarchy.
The belief in British superiority.
Yeah, that Indian lives were less valuable.
It's a toxic mix.
That made famine almost inevitable.
And it leads us to the historical debate.
About the Bengal famine.
Yeah. The interpretations,
Some say it was unavoidable.
wartime pressures, existing problems.
It's bound to happen, they argue.
But others, like Madhusri Mukherjee,
In her book, Churchill's Secret War,
they say British policies made it worse.
they turned a shortage into a catastrophe.
They had a hand in it.
So the question for you is, was it just circumstance?
Or was it indifference?
Did the British choose to let millions die?
It's a heavy question.
And the evidence points to, well,
A deliberate worsening of the crisis?
the Bengal famine. It's a stark reminder
Of the dangers of exploitation.
of putting power before people.
And the consequences of inaction.
And it's still relevant today, right?
Absolutely.
Food security, government responsibility.
These are global issues,
We need to learn from the past.
so we don't repeat the mistakes.
So think about this.
Hmm.
What does this famine tell us about power?
About responsibility.
How do we ensure that history doesn't repeat itself?
It's a question worth pondering.
A question for all of us.
Absolutely.
Thanks for joining us
It's been a pleasure
on this deep dive.
into a dark chapter of history.
We'll see you next time.